Hello everybody, and welcome to your first sample question on parents and grandparents. So if you went through the previous lesson, you have quite a good background on this. Now what we're doing, of course, with these sample questions is taking a look at how to implement that information into an exam context. So I hope you enjoy this sample question. Remember that you have two more after this, making a total of 3 sample questions with this topic. So let's take a look at our first sample question here. Now the person in the sample question is Rosie, and Rosie is a Canadian citizen who is interested in retaining your services to help her parents immigrate to Canada under the family class. She mentions that they are elderly, so she would like to take care of them on a full-time basis at her house in Hamilton, rather than having to visit her native Hungary every couple of months. In determining whether or not Rosie would be an ideal candidate for this program, you take a look at her finances and notice that she has been assessed by Revenue Canada as making $34,000 a year for the past 5 years. She tells you that she also makes an additional $15,000 per year in cash that she does not declare to the government. Rosie's husband, Gunter, works in Romania for 8 months of the year and makes approximately $45,000 per year in his role as a mining engineer. She explains that he visits Canada for about 4 months per year as a tourist and will likely immigrate after her parents obtain permanent resident status. What would you advise Rosie in terms of meeting the financial requirements to sponsor her parents? A. She does not meet the financial requirements. B. She meets the financial requirements on her own. C. She must have Gunter as a cosigner in order to meet the financial requirements. And finally we have D. She must have Gunter as the main applicant and she will co-sponsor it. Alright, so you can see that this is a really tricky question with a lot of elements in it. Now you want to try to figure this out yourself before looking at the explanation, so go ahead and press pause right now. Now if you pressed pause and you were reading through the question again, some of these areas should have jumped out at you. So Rosie's a Canadian citizen, which as we saw is certainly one of those requirements. We can see part of what she wants to do. So she wants to help her parents immigrate to Canada, and why she wants to. She wants to take care of them at her house in Hamilton. We have her finances from Revenue Canada and some extra money that she makes that she does not declare to the government. They talk about her husband as well and his financial situation, as well as what he does in terms of working in Hungary and then visiting Canada. So in this one here we have a few pretty big pieces of the puzzle to really go through. And remember that when you do a lot of these sample questions, or if you're using the simulations that we have, working your way through these big stories will become really concise for you in terms of preparing for your exam. So with Rosie, remember she's a Canadian citizen, which is definitely one of the requirements we're going to have to look at in order to see if she can actually sponsor her parents. In terms of her finances, she has $34,000 per year that she makes, that's declared, and she makes $15,000 a year cash that she does not declare. Now when we look at her intent, because remember that you're always looking at intent in the scenarios of your exam, because it helps you to really realize what can be a correct answer, what cannot be the correct answer. Now, her parents want to live in Canada full time, and she wants her parents to live in Canada full time as well. When we take a look at her spouse, so he makes $45,000 per year. He comes to Canada as a tourist for about 4 months every year. And finally, part of his intent, so he wants to immigrate to Canada as well, but after Rosie's parents obtain their permanent resident status. So now when we go back to the sample question and we take a look at this big story, I hope some of those pieces kind of jump out at you and it makes it a little bit easier to answer. We're going to, of course, take a look at the answers that they provide us. So the question itself is, what would you advise Rosie in terms of meeting the financial requirements to sponsor her parents? Alright, so she does not meet, which is A. She meets the requirements alone. For C, she has to have a cosigner, Gunter. And for D, Gunter has to be the main applicant. So again, we'll explore these one by one just to go through this step by step. Alright, so let's start with B. Now B says she meets the financial requirements on her own. And we can see that in the story. So we can see the amount of money that she makes. She has 2 apparent sources of income, and she has that $34,000 per year that she declares to Revenue Canada, but she has that illegal money that she does not declare to the government. So she makes an additional $15,000 per year in cash that she doesn't declare to the government. So we'll see how this will affect her sponsorship of her parents or grandparents. Now remember, when a person wants to sponsor his or her parents or grandparents, there are some financial requirements that they have to meet. Remember that it's called the LICO, and it has to be proven by the Canadian Revenue Agency. And this has to be for the past 3 years. And remember, this has to be for each of the years. Now with her, you could see that the $15,000 she makes in cash obviously can't be put towards or be used as some type of proof that she meets the LICO, because she didn't declare it. And this is important for, well, for your clients and all that as well. Like, really everything just has to be done legally and ethically, because later on something like this might happen, right? Okay, but we can see that the $34,000 that she's assessed by Revenue Canada is what would be used in this case. So remember as well that this is for the past 3 years. When you're looking at the chart over here, which is in your test date data book, remember that when you're looking at the 3 years, as we saw in the previous lesson, the amount just goes up by around $500 per year. You're not going to have anything too strict or too specific with this. And we could see as well that with her, if she only can prove $34,000 per year for the past 3 years, she doesn't really meet the financial requirements, because she would have to prove for herself, for her parents, and remember, the other piece of the puzzle in here is that she has a husband who's going to be sponsored later on as well. So she would have to prove most likely for 4 people, and she doesn't have that money. Now with that, we can see that B is incorrect. So she certainly does not meet the financial requirements on her own. So the next thing for us to explore is whether or not she can have a cosigner to sponsor her parents. And if you went through the lesson, you probably have an idea about this already, but we'll take a look at this really step by step, just to really reinforce that knowledge that we gained in the previous lesson. All right, when we take a look at C, we have she must have Gunter as a cosigner in order to meet the financial requirements. Now, the pieces of the story that should jump out at you with regard to Gunter is that for Rosie, she wants her parents to immigrate to Canada. So both of her parents, remember her husband Gunter makes $45,000 per year. He visits Canada every year for about 4 months. And after Rosie's parents immigrate to Canada, then Gunter will take the steps to go for his permanent resident status. Alright, so we can see with this one, there's quite a few little elements of the story. Now, when we take a look at this in the context of the answer provided, and in deciding if this answer is correct or incorrect, we have to take a look at what we talked about in the previous lesson, which is co-sponsor requirements. So who can co-sponsor, who cannot co-sponsor? So remember that the big one is that the cosigner must meet the same eligibility requirements as the sponsor. Remember the very basic ones, of course, are that the person is 18 and over, Canadian citizen or permanent resident, and live in Canada. So Gunter, as we saw, is not a permanent resident of Canada and doesn't live in Canada either. Okay, so, and remember that in terms of sponsoring a parent or grandparent, it's slightly different if a person is co-sponsoring, because a spouse can co-sponsor his or her in-laws. And through that analysis, we can see that Gunter cannot be a co-sponsor because he essentially isn't a Canadian. So he's not a Canadian citizen, he's not a permanent resident either. Okay, so that lets us know that C is certainly incorrect. Now we're left with two options. We have she does not meet the financial requirements, or the alternative, which is D. So she must have Gunter as the main applicant, and she will co-sponsor it. From our analysis of C, and how this story, how Gunter and Rosie relate to co-sponsors and those requirements, we could see that D is most likely not correct, but we'll take a look at it in detail. Okay, so remember, we have all this information about Gunter. So he makes a certain amount of money per year. He makes $45,000 per year. And he comes to Canada as a tourist quite a bit. And we have pieces of his intent as well. So he wants to immigrate himself after Rosie's parents obtain their permanent resident status. Now, in the context of the answer here, so she must have Gunter as the main applicant and she will co-sponsor it. Remember, in order to be a sponsor, the very basic requirements, of course, are that a person has to be 18 and over, Canadian citizen or permanent resident. And as we saw, Gunter is not a citizen or a resident, and he doesn't live in Canada either. All right, and of course, he's not sponsoring a parent or grandparent. Now, remember, there are a lot more requirements, but in terms of meeting just these very basic requirements, Gunter does not meet those. So that would lead us, of course, to the conclusion that D is incorrect. Alright, now we're left with A, and I hope you got A as the correct answer when you paused the video before. So we'll take a look at this, of course, in detail again, just to make sure that we have a thorough understanding of LICO and income and co-sponsorship as it relates to this scenario. Now, when we take a look at A, she does not meet the financial requirements. This touches into the analysis we did before. So we could see again that she made a certain amount of money per year that was declared to Revenue Canada. That was $34,000 per year. In the story, they said for the past 5 years, remember that we need to meet the requirements for each of the previous 3 years. And she makes an additional amount in cash that she doesn't declare to the government. Okay, so as we know, it has to be for the past 3 years, for each of the past 3 years. So if you ever have an example where someone made $0 for 1 year and made $100,000 for the other year, that doesn't even out the LICO requirements. The person has to be able to prove that he or she made whatever the LICO is for each of the past 3 years. Okay, remember that the cash does not work for her, doesn't help her in her quest for immigration. That's why, of course, in terms of your clients in the future, you just tell them, this is Canada, just do everything honestly, and it will help you in your new life, of course. So the amount that can be used in terms of immigration is $34,000. However, remember that she has the parents. So she has herself and her parents, which would be 3, and possibly that husband in the future. So we're looking at $34,000 as her income for the past 3 years. However, you can see that she really doesn't meet those LICO requirements. Now, if you got A correct right at the beginning, a very big congratulations. There's a lot of tricky little pieces in this puzzle that you have to separate. So one is with regard to LICO. One is with regard to co-sponsorship. Now, if you got that correct, that shows that you really have a good understanding of both of those tricky little elements with regard to sponsoring parents and grandparents. And as always, a very big thank you. I hope you got the answer correct. I hope this helped to clarify this topic a little bit for you as it relates to the ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Alright, it's always such a pleasure to make these lessons and to talk with everybody. So I thank you for your time and enjoy, because you have 2 more sample questions ready for you right after this.